the Boundless Authenticity Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to the Boundless Authenticity Podcast. My guest today is Thomas, better known as the Paranoid American. I have to laugh a little bit because I was recently on his podcast, Paranoid American, and afterwards I got an email from someone saying they heard me on the Annoyed American podcast. I just sent back an email saying that's the wrong oid. It's paranoid, not annoyed.
I'm going to have to get that domain too now, though. AnnoyedAmerican.com.
Yeah.
Just has the same ring to it.
Yeah, I think we found a hole in your whole system. I could guess that sometimes you get a little annoyed too. I know I do, to say the least. But anyways, if you want to find him, go to paranoidamerican.com. He's on Instagram under the same handle, and you can learn more about conspiracy-themed comic books and get some cool t-shirts and playing cards and other trinkets, as well as tune in to the podcast. So what Thomas has actually done is he's created an incredible and very factual documentary called Adrenochrome, Freemasonry, and MK Ultra. It's only 21 minutes and 15 seconds long. It's probably less time than it takes for you to get out of bed or make a cup of coffee or whatever it is you do. So there's no excuse not to watch it. You can find it on Rumble, and it has been banned from pretty much every other major platform except for X. So you can find that on x.com/paranoidamerica, and I have the links in the show notes. So the major question for today's episode is, what does Adrenochrome have to do with Freemasonry and MK Ultra? But we're also going to get into the origins and what it actually is and provide you with as many facts as possible. So what's going on, sir?
It's going great, man. Actually, coincidentally, this morning I had someone blow up on my Twitter threads, originally disputing, but then eventually offering to procure adrenochrome from a research lab and deliver it to me in person. I have taken them up on this, but I haven't gotten a response yet. But it seems that my research into this topic has only started.
That is great. I mean, I'm laughing my ass off. People will say just about anything on the internet, I think. And again, that lends to the unhealthy side of the discussion about these things. But my first question is, what is adrenochrome?
Adrenochrome is a naturally occurring chemical that's in our blood right now. I don't want to alarm anybody, but if you're listening and you can hear my voice, you literally have adrenochrome in your bloodstream at this exact moment, and there's nothing you can do about it. Because adrenochrome is just a natural byproduct of your body processing adrenaline. If your body doesn't process adrenaline, it causes problems for your heart. So it has to break down and oxidize in some way, adrenochrome being one of the many different forms that adrenaline eventually degrades into. So that's the short, quick answer of adrenochrome. And I guess the more controversial aspect is that it is likely, or at least has been shown to be in studies dating back 70 plus years, that is a psychoactive chemical that can actively cause hallucinations, distortion in perception, all of the things that you would expect from LSD, mescaline, psilocybe, all of these different chemicals. It's a little bit more mild when you compare it to all of those, but it absolutely has been documented to have all of these effects. That's kind of the entry point into adrenochrome. And then if you get way down the rabbit hole, depending on which movies and TV and conspiracy theories you've read, they might just be popping like a Capri Sun straw into a baby's head and torturing it and sucking the adrenochrome straight out of the pineal gland. None of that part is true, by the way, or at least not the pineal gland aspect. But that's kind of an amalgamation of what is adrenochrome from three different perspectives.
Now that we know that this thing is a real thing, what are the exact biological effects that it has on the body?
This is where it comes into a slight dispute. So almost all of the research that specifically talks about the psychoactive effects of adrenochrome comes from 2 to 3 scientists, Abram Hoffer, Humphrey Osmond, and a guy named John Smithies. All three of them tended to collaborate with each other in various aspects. And ironically, one of the things that they shared in common is the Scottish Rite Northern Jurisdiction 33rd Degree Supreme Council was the main financier of all of this adrenochrome research. dating to at least the 1930s through the mid 1970s. Specifically in 1960, Abram Hoffer and Osmond published an entire study where they tested a bunch of different people, 20 different people. I think actually 34 separate people all were given adrenochrome and were asked what the subjective effects were. Out of those 34 people, this is the most interesting part, 20 of them got active adrenochrome, 14 of them got a placebo, all right? Out of the placebo group, only one person reported any alteration in their perception of thought, mood, personality, what have you. Out of that placebo group, half of them, 7 of the 14, reported getting anxiety from adrenochrome. Again, this was the placebo group, so it does make sense that someone gives you a drug and you're just sitting there waiting for it to take effect. Maybe you get anxious over that, which contrasts heavily with the 20 people that took active adrenochrome. One of those people out of the 20 reported anxiety. And over half, overwhelmingly, described changes to perception, changes to their thought, changes in their mood, changes in their personality, and a carryover effect to the next day, and that they could still feel the effects of the adrenochrome a full day after. This was a very small sample size. I mean, 34 is almost nothing when it comes to this type of research. And this is also highlights one of the weird and unique aspects of adrenochrome research, in that outside of Abram Hoffer, Smithies, and Osmond, almost nobody has looked into the psychedelic or psychoactive effects of this drug. And in fact, Hoffer even cites in his own papers from the 50s and the 60s that the researchers that tended to try and discredit his findings and said that these were, false findings, they did not do adrenochrome research. They just read the paper and then responded to it without saying, and here's my research providing evidence to the counter. None of that has actually ever happened as far as I'm aware. So this is kind of like the original concept. And that's just the human trials. And they did it on themselves, their friends, their wives. Like part of that sample group I just mentioned were the wives of these researchers. So they kind of just brought it home from the lab, got their friends together and said, hey, who wants to try this crazy stuff? So that's about as far as the human psychedelic research goes. But there are plenty of other documented research. They tested it on spiders, pigeons, mice, rabbits, cats, dogs, monkeys, everything you can think of. One of the best examples I got of this, and this might be a little bit dated, but I remember growing up seeing all sorts of educational films and reading like books in the school library about LSD and mescaline, psilocybin. And one of the most famous sequences were these pictures of spiders where they would give an orb weaver spider different psychedelics and then analyze how that affected the way that they would create the pattern in their web, because orb weaver spiders have a very specific pattern that they repeat over and over. It's incredibly consistent. So once they started introducing LSD and all kinds of things, cocaine, I think they gave them mescaline, you could see a direct, yes, you could see an immediate, and actually the guy that did this was named Peter N. Witt. This was in the 1940s. He was a German pharmacologist, and he puts together all of these in 1954, 200 different pictures of all these spiders. Among those, typically the LSD ones get shown around a lot. It's like, wow, look, this spider got the trip. Look at this web. But it was also included adrenochrome, and the adrenochrome experiment with the orb weaver spider also showed the same sort of abnormality in when they went to go and create their web. So I think that was one of the first times when it was like, oh, there might be an objective relation here. This is also exactly where the public even hears about adrenochrome. We hear about adrenochrome through Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell. It's actually mentioned 2 times by page 3 in Doors of Perception. And the reason that he even wrote about it is because Aldous Huxley was given his first dose of mescaline from Humphrey Osmond, the same guy that was collaborating with Abram Hoffer and all this. So there's a direct connection between these 3 people that kind of were unique in that they were studying psychoactive effects of adrenochrome, going directly to Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley writes it in his book, and he lists it alongside mescaline, psilocybin, LSD. So here's a very direct connection of it being a known psychedelic with multiple researchers all confirming this, multiple papers, all sorts of different animals tested on having predictable and repeatable results. So, I mean, I don't know how much more I can put on the table to convince that this is not just a random conspiracy theory somebody thought up when they were shooting Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the movie adaptation, which, by the way, I believe Terry Gilliam, in the director commentary of that movie, makes this claim that they made it up for the movie as like this fictional thing, which is also demonstrably false.
Right. Well, we all know that Hunter S. Thompson was on something, a lot of somethings.
And I don't doubt that he was actually doing adrenochrome, but a lot of people that come to disprove adrenochrome as a psychedelic or even as a chemical at all, which is even crazier. But a lot of people, if they hone it down and just like, oh, it doesn't actually have any effects, a lot of it is based on them assuming that all of that came from Fear and Loathing, which, I mean, the book was like 1971, I think, predating the movie by at least 20 plus years. And even in Fear and Loathing that Hunter S. Thompson wrote about, he wasn't even the first one. It was written about in fiction 3 or 4 times prior to that, up to a decade or earlier before. So it's been around for a while. Science has known about it. And I guess I'll squeeze in one little aspect here because the title of that documentary I made is called Adrenochrome, Freemasonry, and MK Ultra. I am full, knowing that that is a very like clickbaity title, but it's also 100% accurate. And one of the reasons why I don't think we know a lot about adrenochrome as a psychedelic is because during that transition, especially in like the mid 50s, is when a lot of these studies were being published. That orb weaver spider I just mentioned, MK Ultra takes the stage, and at that point, the U.S. government decides all psychedelics are kind of like a state secret. It's almost like a military use that they've got in mind for it, so it's not really ready for public consumption, and it eventually makes its way to the controlled substances list, I believe.
Yeah, that is factual because I've read stuff on that too. And it's, you know, what they really needed was a guy like Sid Gottlieb to come in and just spike everybody because he must have been a dangerous son of a bitch in college. Like, just, he's the guy that spiked the punch with everything. I remember reading about him and he would just dose everybody with LSD or whatever it is they were testing and just not even tell him. He just wanted to see what would happen.
Well, he earned the nickname Dirty Trickster. That was his legit name, even in the professional world. He was known as the Dirty Trickster, and I believe the Black Sorcerer. Make that of which you will, but that is also documented in many of his biographies that those were his 2 nicknames. I don't know if that's the person that you're like, hey, come on over, and then like you leave him with a punch bowl and you walk into the other room and just assume he's not going to do anything.
Yeah, I remember reading the story about they stopped taking cigarettes from him or something like that because you never know what he would put in it, you know.
And I guess one of the most publicized cases that shows the type of person Sidney Gottlieb was the case of Frank Olson, who was working at the biochem laboratories for the CIA, and he was basically given LSD in a glass of some kind of liquor. It was like Cointreau or something, and he drinks it, and I'm going to assume, because we don't have a lot of his subjective records, but basically like sees the face of God or whatever, like taps into like this other dimension or different perspective of understanding. When he comes back to, he kind of has these thoughts like, oh my God, I'm creating weapons of like war and biochemical warfare. Maybe what I'm doing isn't right. And almost in a way becomes like a conscientious objector before maybe that term even existed. Which essentially got him pushed out of a window.
Fell
out. I mean, yeah, it was a sealed window that didn't normally open. It was broken. They showed that the glass pieces had to have been broken from that. Anyway, without getting into that whole case, that is basically one of the better examples that's documented of the type of guy Sidney Gottlieb was. He would basically dose a coworker and then gaslight them and their family for decades. And I think one of the most important aspects of this is before anyone knew what LSD necessarily was. So it's not like he would just dose someone and then someone's like, oh, I think someone gave me a psychedelic. And then you can kind of process that. This would just be, you start seeing things and hearing things and have absolutely no idea where it's coming from. And you don't even know that this is something being actively researched. That must have been a next level of terrifying.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway for the listeners is that they did that with LSD, and that was the kind of people that these researchers were. Like they would just dose people and do whatever they wanted to do with thinking there was no consequence. And adrenochrome was probably the same thing, you know, like they probably just did whatever they wanted to do and then lied about it afterwards because they burned most of those documents, right? When you're talking about Frank Olson and stuff, you're talking about things that you know, half of it's gone for one reason or another, because didn't his daughter or somebody like that take them to court, take the CIA and
Absolutely. Only after they exhumed the body and had it investigated against the CIA's suggestions. They were like, oh, you don't want to traumatize yourself. You want to see, you know, your dead dad decaying inside. Like, let's just let, you know, sleeping dogs lie. But they exhumed the body, and then through that process and doing a very, very postmortem autopsy, discovered that there was also blunt force trauma to the back of the head, or it might have been, I think it was from the back of the head, which kind of gave more evidence that he was dead before he hit the ground. So a lot of this, you mentioned they got away with it. Like, not only did they get away with it, almost every person in these levels of MK Ultra's research, Gottlieb and Dr. Ewan Cameron and a whole list of them, they basically lived to old age retirement, just doing what they want to do. There was pretty much no real repercussions for any of this, legally, socially, morally, or other.
So wasn't Dr. Ewan Cameron involved in the adrenochrome studies too?
No, I don't believe Dr. Ewan Cameron was involved in that. He was just another MK Ultra scientist that also got to basically have free reign on human experimentation with no real legal repercussions. I do believe that some of those victims sued the state. So Canada eventually, because I believe he was at Montreal. So Canada eventually pays out, just like when the family of Frank Olson sues the CIA, the state pays out, but the actual people involved, like this, you know, the Sidney Gottliebs and the Ewan Camerons and the long list of others, George Hunter Whites, they aren't ever really brought any sort of consequences. So, I mean, it's a weird state of being, right? When you're like, that person did this illegal thing that caused my family to lose a member. And they're like, okay, don't worry, the government will cut you this check. And it's like, wait, but that guy is like still out roaming and publishing books and being accredited. So it's sort of a sad outcome, especially when you look into any of the victims and what happened to them. The best case scenario is they might have gotten like a few $100,000.
You know, that's even sadder because that is exactly the kind of system that we do live in and hasn't changed. People are allowed to do whatever they want to you and roam the streets, and the government thinks they can just pay you off, you know? But I got to ask a question about, you know, the conspiracy theory aspect of this thing. Like, why do you think adrenochrome is mostly just a conspiracy theory to people? And why do they always try to bring in the elite and the sacrifices and the human trafficking and things like that? What does that have to do with anything?
Well, why does any conspiracy theory exist is because there is an intentional obfuscation of information. There's a complete lack of transparency, which invites a lot of speculation. So like I was even mentioning earlier, even Abram Hoffer, during his research in the 50s, made this very specific note of like, hey, it's weird that all these other scientists that keep trying to discredit our work and our papers, they just kind of hand wave it and say, oh, that's not possible. And they would publish it and get, they're accredited researchers. So people would read those and say, oh, well, Dr. B says that Dr. A is wrong about that. So I guess that it was all a fake scam all to begin with. And this was blowing Hoffer's mind at the time too. Like, why is anyone doing this? And again, I think it does lead into, they wanted to keep any sort of psychedelics research kind of under wraps for military and sort of intelligence reasons. And that is that intentional obfuscation, a lack of transparency. You let that fester for about 70 years. And now the only outlet that adrenochrome research has starts with Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, and then it works its way into science fiction and sort of like horror novels. And not beyond that. There's really no other research aside from Abram Hoffer's work that goes into this aspect of it. So that's half of it. The other half too is that when it gets into the conspiracy theory angle, it gets conflated very often with two different topics. One of those is pineal gland, which we could talk about, which is not really related to adrenochrome in any tangible way, but also adrenochrome is incredibly unique in addition to adrenaline, which was first synthesized in 1901. So it's fairly new in the scope of, humanity and even just like modern science. They finally discover how to synthesize adrenaline. From there, they start recognizing that adrenaline is chemically very similar to mescaline and a host of other sort of serotonergic drugs that have these like pronounced effects. They start walking backwards, and one of the ideas is, oh, I wonder if people that have schizophrenia or dementia or getting into these like hallucinogenic fits, I wonder if there's some sort of a blood in their or a drug in their bloodstream that's causing these hallucinations. And this goes back way, way before 1901. I think even Carl Jung had an assumption of something called toxin X, which in itself is based on even older research from like ancient times that all were trying to explain away dementia and schizophrenia as like this outside thing or a chemical imbalance before that term even existed inside the body. And eventually they isolate the blood of schizophrenic patients, detect high levels of adrenochrome, and then start to assume, oh, there's this chemical in the blood called adrenochrome that's making them act crazy. The reason that I sort of brought all that up is because the conspiracy comes from that this is actually in human blood. You can theoretically and very feasibly take a human being, extract their blood, and then convert that into adrenochrome, and then ingest that adrenochrome and have a psychedelic experience. It wouldn't be cut and dry or very easy. It would probably be the least efficient way of obtaining adrenochrome would be to like go through humans' blood and isolate and all this. You'd probably watch it oxidize right in front of you and lose all of its potency in that process. But it is theoretically possible to do all of that. So now you have the first instance of blood magic, but now in a secular scientific term, where maybe before it was just rumors and legends and stories about, oh, you torture someone and you drink their blood and you get to talk to God. Well, now there's a scientific basis for that. So as soon as that happens, which I think is around the 1930s to 40s, but by the 50s, when this is being actively talked about by Huxley and by all the science fiction writers, they kind of run with this because it's the perfect blending of blood libel conspiracies, of all sorts of other like sacrificial conspiracies. So it kind of meets this old world and the new world, and the conspiracies can just like thrive in this because now there's a central focal point of some of the oldest taboos that we've got matched with a chemical that no one was necessarily allowed to research or publish any of their research about.
Okay, well, fair enough. That seems to be the way that it is with conspiracy theories, though. It's just always enough information to confuse the shit out of you. And so you never actually really understand what's going on unless you're willing to go really deep, And I don't think very many want to go that deep. It's easier to just have things that are like brain candy. You can talk about it with your friends or get over whatever jollies you get out of it,
Well, and there's another even more important dynamic here, I guess more relevant now in the 2020s, because I don't know what kind of censorship would have been around adrenochrome in the 1990s if he just started publishing papers or talking about it. I don't know if it had achieved the same sort of nefarious conspiracy theory lore and all the baggage that comes with it. But what I think started fascinating me the most was that when I started posting about this, like, hey, here's a research paper from the 1950s. Here's evidence that they tested it on spiders, pigeons, mice, rabbits, cats, monkeys, humans, right? Here's the documented evidence. And those posts would get like strikes and like accounts banned. And it was the weirdest thing because I guess in my weird monkey brain in the back, I was like, wait a minute, I'm just publishing research paper from the 50s. It's pretty boring. It's not even really saying anything. If anything, it says they're fairly mild compared to the other psychedelics known. Yet any mention of adrenochrome would kind of get classified as misinformation or hate speech or violent, dangerous speech. And that's, I think, what piqued my curiosity the most out of anything was that why is this otherwise benign, naturally occurring chemical that's in our blood right now? Why is this such a taboo subject? And why did it get conflated with like all of this QAnon and all these other, I guess, like radical extremist conspiracies? So I guess part of me is like the lady doth protest too much in a way. Like, why is there so much censorship about not letting anyone mention this. Why not let people talk about it and then just point out, oh, that's not true, here's the facts? But it's just any discussion of it is not allowed.
I totally understand how you feel, because I'm in the same boat as you with all the stuff I talk about. I get hit with strikes for no reason, you know? YouTube doesn't even want me on there anymore. And
well, the one that proved it to me the most, and everyone that I knew that had already been streaming and doing YouTube for years and years before I even thought about creating a channel, but they were like, man, just don't do it. Don't talk about Adrenochrome. Don't post the video. You're wasting your time working on this 20-minute doc. Because it took me like a couple months to really put all of it together. And I'm just thinking, like, you guys are insane. Like, you're just paranoid conspiracy. Like, I get it. I'm in the same world too. But if I just post scientific research and I show, here's the research paper, and don't make any salacious claims, don't say anything about babies or torture or black magic or blood, like none of that, just all science, no one's going to take this down. What are they going to strike? Like a research paper? It turns out, yes. Not only will they also do that, but I was like, okay, well, maybe it's the mention of the word drug or psychedelic, or maybe because I mentioned ibogaine or, mushrooms or any of these. So I went back through the documentary and I literally beeped out every single instance of the word blood, drug, adrenochrome, cocaine, DMT, like anything at all that you couldn't say in front of like a fifth grade elementary class, right? I bleeped all of that out. I even went on to the visuals and I even used the mosaic or just like a little black bar, and I blocked out every single time those words were shown on the screen. And even doing all of that, I still was getting strikes and takedowns from uploading this. So at that point, I was like, okay, I get the message. Everyone that was telling me that this is just like the ultimate taboo subject that you're not allowed to talk about in any capacity, they were right and I was wrong. And it's still hard for me to like sort of understand why any of that would happen. Why was the 20-minute documentary that you saw, why is that being classified as hate speech? Like, that's literally the takedown, was that it was related to hate speech. And I think it is because this connection of blood libel to adrenochrome, which only exists in the minds of a small minority of people, it seems.
yeah, and I think if anybody really understood how deep it went, they would figure out that all of their false idols on TV and, their favorite musicians and everything were probably inculcated into something that was quite dark. And that's where you get into all that other crazy stuff like spirit cooking and all this crazy shit,
Well, and there's another interesting intersection that I didn't expect to come up on all this too, but some of the names in the spirit cooking and the Pizzagate and all of that, a prevalent name that comes up often is Podesta, right? John and Tony Podesta brothers. And in fact, the whole Pizzagate came from leaked emails from Podesta's email account that got phished, I believe, because he had like some really basic, it was like speed 1234, runner 1234, something like really easy. They got into the emails. They find these weird cryptic messages about maps on handkerchiefs to pizza places and walnut sauce and all. Like, I'm sure you've heard all of the rumors of all these things. But there's also an interesting connection to like this world of high art, like the artistic society, where the Marina Abramovic type characters come into play, right? They do all of these spear cooking sessions, typically in these modern museums of art or in these like highfalutin sort of environments where people pay $50,000 for a plate to be in the grace of celebrities and artists doing this thing, so they can feel like they're cultured. Well, the very first time that I'm aware of that adrenochrome enters the art world was in either 94 or 96 by a very popular artist, the richest artist in the UK, named Damien Hirst. And he puts out this series of paintings called Dots. He put out a lot of them, but one of those paintings in particular was called Adrenochrome Semicarbazone something or other. But now you've got a painting where someone has drawn adrenochrome. It gets snatched up by a German collector. It was his first large purchase. It happened at Christie's in London. 15 years later, he's now the richest UK artist on the planet. I think last net worth was estimated around $390 million. Not that it all came from that adrenochrome painting, but the reason that I bring this up is that here is the high art world now sort of like engaging with this adrenochrome concept. Damien Hirst is also known for some pretty provocative works, lots of like people that have been cut in half, sculptures, not real people, but like pregnant women that have been cut in half to reveal the inside of the body, the inside of the fetus, like pretty visceral stuff. He also was pretty famous about one called, I think it was like Mother and Calf or something. And this is where he cut a cow and its calf in half, suspended them in formaldehyde and in glass, and put this in art museums. So you would just walk through, and the whole art exhibit was just a cow sliced in half, and you could see inside of its body. So again, like this very visceral aspect. One of the collectors of Damien Hirst's other work, which is documented, well documented on art websites, are the Podesta brothers. In particular, Tony Podesta collected a number of them. Some of them even more strange than a picture of dots. Like a lot of them were maps of like World War III and different places with like body counts as if bombs were going to hit Europe and how many people would die there. And we're talking about an art piece here, right? Just an interesting eclectic collection of things that the Podesta brothers were into. But this is, I think, where a lot of the conspiracy also gets conflated with all of this, because now in the high art world where they're doing spirit cooking, they're doing like these Pizzagate style rituals, politicians and celebrities join in, and it probably gives them this sense of, again, like I'm cultured now, like I'm just a boring politician normally, I'm a lawyer, on all other aspects of life, and this boring lawyer that's just doing court cases and rhetorical skills all day, but I want to feel like I'm part of like a bigger movement, and I've got something more to my right brain, and I'm more creative. So I think that the artists also say like, hey, that guy's got money, but he's also got a big vacuous space that he's trying to fill. Come into the fold, come to this like spirit cooking ritual party with us. And it ends up being a great collaboration between the two, because now you've got both people elevating the status of the other. You've got the artists that are now being justified and given credibility because of how close they are in relation to celebrities and politicians. But now you've also got politicians that's like, look, I'm not just a suit and a lawyer. Like I'm a fancy artist too. Look, I'm getting invited to MoMA again.
Having said that, let's get back into the evidence that maybe adrenochrome has longevity promoting properties. Like, what is that about?
Okay, so this one comes specifically again from Abram Hoffer. And Abram Hoffer put out a number of papers. The very first one was called the Adrenochrome hypothesis. And this was the very beginning of him basically discussing the possibility that adrenochrome either caused schizophrenia or was somehow directly related to schizophrenia. And then I think the first version of this was sometime in the 1960s. He continues to build on this over and over. And by 1996, he puts out sort of a summary of all his other years of work up to that point. And in this, he has this hypothesis that kind of makes a lot of sense, highly disputed by other people, the same ones that have been disproving his credit since the 50s. But his idea is that if you were to oversimplify it, there's almost like two classes of people. There are those that are predisposed to heart disease and cancer, and there are those that are predisposed to dementia and schizophrenia. These obviously are not two exclusively mutual groups. There's plenty of cases where someone has both. There's cases where someone has neither, both personally and in their family line. But and I believe it's called Adrenochrome Hypothesis Revisited. And in this, he states some pretty large claims, but that people that are predisposed to schizophrenia or that have schizophrenia in their family line are more resistant to malignant cancers. So like if they did get cancer, it would be something that they could have removed and it wouldn't come back. And also less instances of heart problems. And then the opposite was also true, that people that had high instances of cancer in their family or heart problems tended to not have schizophrenia in their family line. So based on these very like initial observations, he goes deeper and deeper into it, all the way to, I guess one of the most salacious claims he makes is that the bubonic plague or the Black Plague, the people that survived it might have been majority schizophrenics, or at least have had the genetic trait of schizophrenia in their family line, and that this sort of implies that adrenochrome, because let me explain how adrenochrome comes into this. Like I mentioned, in the 1930s through 50s, that concept that Jung had of toxin X, or that schizophrenics just had this weird chemical in their system making them act this way. The assumption was that that chemical was adrenochrome. So I guess the deduction here was that adrenochrome itself would cause schizophrenia. So therefore, taking adrenochrome can help you beat the bubonic plague, or taking adrenochrome can help it make it so you won't get cancer and therefore you'll live longer. He also states things like a more youthful appearance, slower aging, less wrinkles, more creative, more poets, musicians, artists will tend to be from families that have detailed histories of schizophrenia and dementia. Again, this is not mutually exclusive. This isn't like if you don't have schizophrenia in your family, you'll never write a good song. That's not really how that worked. But this was highly conflated and acknowledged by Hoffer that it's not adrenochrome that is doing this. It's not that you just ingest adrenochrome and now you live longer and now you beat cancer and now you look younger. It's more so that if you have higher levels of adrenochrome in your blood than a normal person, then it also means that your body, for whatever reason, is sort of entering these fight or flight responses more often than not compared to a baseline person. And that you might not even realize this. Your body is just so good through your family line that you just happen to produce lots of adrenaline constantly, and your body's constantly processing it to make sure that you're not feeling the effects of it, having a heart attack or any other kind of problems. So that would go to say that that person that's constantly producing more adrenaline than others is exhibiting the signs of someone that has dementia or schizophrenia in their family. So really the adrenochrome hypothesis is more like, if you've got schizophrenia in your family, there's a better chance that you'll live longer, even if it's not necessarily under the best terms. Like, great, you'll live longer, but you might also have dementia as you get older. But he also pointed out that if you had schizophrenia and recovered from it, specifically what they used to call dementia praecox, which is if an old person gets dementia, it's just like grandpa's sunsetting. He's acting weird. That's what old people do, right? There's not really like a lot of hope for it. But if you see a 20-year-old son acting like your 80-year-old grandpa, now it's a cause for concern, because that isn't typically normal. And without getting on a whole tangent that I don't have enough research on, but also that early onset schizophrenia, dementia praecox, would tend to be linked to some sort of early traumatic experience, often sexual by nature, like as a kid. But it's not just like a switch that just flips and all of a sudden your body is producing extra adrenaline and causing schizophrenia. There's like an actual environmental stimulus that the body responds and enters this new state. So the whole adrenochrome hypothesis was more like the schizophrenic bloodline hypothesis, and how having schizophrenia in your family can lead to longer youthful experience, more creative, I guess, like expressions. Now, this easily gets conflated to like, oh, you're saying that if I drink adrenochrome, I can write a hit album, or I'm an artist now? That's kind of where it gets taken to. If you simplify it all into like 5 words, that's kind of where a lot of these conspiracy theories kind of come from, is that like misconception that adrenochrome is the thing, when really it's just an indicator of something else going on.
Yeah, but it doesn't help that they wave this stuff right in front of your face too, because if you remember, and I know you know about this, like that movie, was it Bruce Willis or somebody? Death Becomes Her. Was it Meryl Streep? Am I thinking of the right thing?
Right, and they've got a little pink vial of potion that lets them live forever. Essentially, they've got like a youth serum.
Yeah, and then I remember watching an episode or 2 of The Simpsons. I think it's actually mentioned several times in The Simpsons. But doesn't Mr. Burns...
That episode is called Blood Feud, and this is where Montgomery Burns discovers that if he takes Bart's blood, then he can keep himself youthful.
Yeah, and I think even more recently, Machine Gun Kelly, too, they kind of wave that in front of your face in some one of his music videos, too, where there's like some kind of a pink, reddish substance that they're playing with. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I saw it and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Because it was
this also, again, adds to a little bit of the conspiracy conflation, because before even adrenaline was discovered. Even if you want to turn back the clock as far as you can, when the first person discovered the adrenal glands, I think it was like, I'm going to make up a number, I think it was like 1858. And it was like some French guy, but no one had necessarily put their finger on, here's this substance that causes this kind of behavior or even gives any sort of youth serum properties. But what does go way before that are like Elizabeth of Bathory, right? The lady that would like bathe in the blood of young women and children in order to like give herself a youthful appearance. Almost all blood magic can be tied back to these concepts of eternal youth, or at least prolonging your life. So it's on a kind of a different track than adrenochrome specifically. We're getting into blood magic, vampirism, even cannibalism in some cases. But I think the key point here is that in 1901 and then in the 1930s, when adrenochrome is discovered, a lot of people start saying, oh, this thing is like this thing, and it combines into the same thing, when really, I mean, they're related tangentially, but it's not the same thing. I don't think there was ever really a claim of adrenochrome specifically providing everlasting youth until some of that Hoffer research came in. Now, another thing that gets conflated, and I know it gets messy, there's so many angles here. Another thing that gets conflated almost always, especially if you go on like Twitter or Instagram or any of the conspiracy threads and channels, is people will be like, oh, adrenochrome comes from the pineal gland. Well, that's not true at all. The pineal gland's in the center of your brain, is part of the endocrine system. It does regulate hormones, but it does not regulate adrenaline. The adrenaline comes from your adrenal glands, which are on top of your kidneys, which is pretty damn far away in relation within the human body. I mean, this is like saying I got it in California, but really you got it in New York. So these things are not the same, but some of the claims about what the pineal gland could do to the human body reflect things that we hear now about adrenochrome. I've got newspaper articles that date back to the 1930s and earlier that show they were feeding pineal glands to chickens, to cows, even to human beings, specifically children. And the claim was that feeding children pineal glands, or feeding chicks or calves pineal glands, would cause them to age and enter puberty much faster. Some of the newspaper claims are things like, again, I'll paraphrase it. I can look it up if you need the exact quote, but I'll paraphrase. It's like, give your 7-year-old some pineal glands and they'll be ready to help you out on the farm like they were, a 15-year-old in the course of months, instead of waiting years for them to help you on the farm. A lot of these were like fantastical claims that didn't necessarily get backed up. As far as I know, maybe this is just more suppressed research, but here we have another instance of consuming part of another human being's body and having some tangible growth effect, youth effect. It's sort of in that same line. So you can see how easily someone being like, oh yeah, well, eat their pineal gland, or if I eat their adrenal gland, or if I drink their blood, it's all the same. It all has the same effect. It all gets conflated into one thing. So that was one of the hardest things in my research, is meticulously separating, but not ignoring, and continuously acknowledging, but like pineal gland claims, adrenaline and adrenochrome claims, blood magic claims. These are all sort of three separate things. But once, you're not allowed to talk about adrenochrome, it's so easy to just pile all those. And now adrenochrome represents all of the things.
Right. As you were talking about that, I couldn't help but think of Miserlou. I remember there was like a creepy guy, right, when I lived in Pennsylvania.
Also named adrenochrome. That was the American release title, was adrenochrome.
Yeah. There was a creepy guy that lived in the basement in my house in Pennsylvania, and he told me about watching that movie one time, and I was like, what? And back then I wasn't really so much into like adrenochrome and what it was and all that kind of stuff. I focused on other things, but I remember he creeped me out because he used to watch all these different horror movies and stuff, and he would just talk about them all the time. But that was the one that stood out to me.
Well, and that was like 2016, 2017. So you're kind of lucky that you dodged all of this nonsense for such a long time. Yeah. It goes back so deep, man. I would almost say that Miserlou, or that adrenochrome movie, is probably like one of the turning points. Not that it was a catalyst, but it was an indicator of how like the sort of mass popularity that this concept of adrenochrome being this satanic, psychedelic, supernatural substance started to become very mainstream. And I found some of the notes of the specific claims that Abram Hoffer makes in his research paper that goes to this youth serum aspect. So I'll give you the highlights that I found the most interesting. So here, this is in Abram Hoffer's words from his 1996 Adrenochrome Hypothesis Revisited. He says, there is no overall advantage in having schizophrenia in being sick. The advantage arises from having the genes of schizophrenia, which do not express themselves in the first order relatives of the patients. And then he says, parents, children, and siblings of schizophrenics will have the advantages of the recovered patients. And then he cites what these advantages are. Physical advantages are a more youthful appearance, especially as you age, less gray hair, fewer attacks of autoimmune diseases, more ability to tolerate pain, more resistance against bacterial infections, and evidence of getting cancer less frequently. He then states intellectual pros, not more intelligent, but more creative in thinking, and many become top scientists, artists, writers, and poets. And then he kind of summarizes all this again, and he says, patients who are ill, meaning patients that get schizophrenia, and then regain these advantages when they recover. If every potential schizophrenic were giving adequate amounts of vitamin B3, niacin, before they became ill, they would have less probability of becoming sick and would enjoy the advantages. The reason that this is such an important aspect is that aside from Hoffer being one of the only people, along with Smithies and Osmond, but this is the first time that he's acknowledging this concept of vitamin B3 or niacin having some miraculous effect across the board. And in fact, Abram Hoffer is also known as the father of orthomolecular medicine, which he's the one that basically fortifies cereals. Like when you look on the back of the Cheerios and it's like it's got iron and it's got vitamin A, B, C, D, niacin. Like, how do all those vitamins get in there? Like, they don't naturally grow in the Cheerio plant, right? So those are added to the process afterwards. And most of this was based on his research specifically about vitamin B3 niacin. So many cereals now, lots of basically poor people food. That was kind of where his avenue was at, is that he looked around and he saw everyone that was living in poverty couldn't afford to eat eggs and bacon and sort of fresh food. A lot of them were resorting to grain-based cereals because they were shelf stable, they were cheaper, they would fill you up even if they didn't provide any nutrition. And that latter part of not providing any real nutrition was causing widespread issues across the board. And then he just realized, hey, by fortifying these, by giving people the vitamins that they're otherwise lacking because they're living in abject poverty, this will solve a lot of these issues. So like the adrenochrome research and the research he had into niacin, vitamin B3, are almost hard to separate at a certain point. No one really makes vitamin B3 a taboo subject. Almost none of the other avenues of research got taboo, except for his claims about adrenochrome.
That is some wild shit. I don't even know what to ask you next. Because
Well, you were mentioning too the Miserlou and the adrenochrome movie. So I mean, I've got a thread on X that I've been working on. It represents like 4+ years of research, but I really do think that I can trace some of the lore that gets surrounded by all this. Like, why is Miserlou about torturing people? And like, it's a horror movie, essentially. It's like a psychedelic horror movie. So why is it that adrenochrome is linked to horror movies? And what is it about adrenochrome that adrenaline doesn't get the same treatment? Because technically, if adrenochrome comes from adrenaline, then anything that you could do to have someone produce adrenaline should also be taboo, but it's not. Adrenaline's never been a taboo subject. And I think that a lot of this is how adrenochrome was introduced to the public. So I'll give the quickest, we can stop if you want to go into any of these, but I'll give like my quick sort of chronological introduction of adrenochrome as this weird satanic drug to the masses. Doors of Perception is 1954, is when Aldous Huxley writes about it based on what he heard from Osmond Humphreys. Then there's in 1959, there's this movie called The Tingler by Vincent Price. And the whole entire premise of the movie, this is the first time I believe that LSD was introduced to the public through a Hollywood movie. As the movie opens, he's reading a book, and the book says something about like inducing fear through injecting LSD 25. And the premise of that movie is that if you can induce such an extreme amount of fear in a human body, that fear will manifest into an actual physical manifestation of just pure fear. Like it looks like a monstrosity scorpion slug that grows out of the person's spine and can leave their body and just cause havoc. And this is the tingler, because people would feel like a tingling sensation in their spine. And the idea was like, oh no, that's an actual like demon. Like you've just summoned a demon into this plane. This had nothing to do with adrenochrome. It had to do with LSD. But in 1958, the difference between LSD and mescaline and psilocybin and adrenochrome might as well have just been like, like a green or a blue Lucky Charm marshmallow or something, right? They were just sort of different forms of the same psychedelic experience. Not true, but that was one of the premises. From there, same year, there's a book called Naked Lunch that gets published by William S. Burroughs about a doctor named Dr. Benway, I believe, who was based on an actual MKUltra researcher who did torture patients and gave them, I believe, scopolamine, bulbocapnine, like a whole bunch of different fear-inducing drugs. So here's this theme, right? That psychedelics are introduced, and the first time that the public is made aware of them, they're all talking about relations to inducing these extreme amounts of fear beyond the human experience. Then we've got 1962 Clockwork Orange, and in Clockwork Orange, a substance called Adrenochrome, which the writer of that actually got his inspiration directly from Aldous Huxley. He also writes about them taking this Adrenochrome and getting, ultra violent. This is, if anyone's seen Clockwork Orange, it's basically about a bunch of criminals that just go and wreak havoc and beat people up and like do insane things out in the world. So this is probably the first instance of adrenochrome being mentioned directly in relation to people being violent and acting crazy. Then you've got a short story in 1967 called Blood of a Wig by a guy named Terry Southern, who also helped write some of Stanley Kubrick's films. One of them, Dr. Strangelove, which mentions fluoride conspiracy theories and stuff. So now you've got this like conspiracy theorist angle and over the top aspect of like creating fear and generating demons in the real world. And then slowly, then we get Fear and Loathing. Then we've got a book called The Winter Market, where again, they're talking about stealing adrenochrome and using it for all these psychedelic purposes, all on the black market. And then it just keeps increasing from there. And I think that it conflates very easily with any sort of satanic or blood ritual. Like you mentioned, the Death Becomes Her. Death Becomes Her doesn't actually mention adrenochrome at any point. It doesn't mention any drugs. They just show this pink vial. But since that movie came out in 1992, this is 40 years after research on adrenochrome has been put out. And the very first time that scientifically Hoffer identifies adrenochrome as a psychedelic was through something called pink adrenaline. Pink adrenaline being an expired EpiPen, epinephrine being another name for adrenaline. And in World War II, I believe, they were finding, and they were like, you'd be out in the field, right? You don't have time to wait for a brand new fresh batch of EpiPens to come in. If you need it now. So once they got to the end of the supplies, all of the expired ones that looked a little bit discolored, they were still using them because they needed them. And soldiers started describing these weird hallucinations they were having, visual, auditory, feeling weird. The same thing that I mentioned before in those human trials on adrenochrome, they're mentioning these exact same experiences. And that's where Hoffer and Smithies are like, wait a minute, this sounds identical to the experience that we had when we tested adrenochrome directly. So they realized that pink adrenaline, these expired EpiPens, was literally just aqueous adrenochrome. What color is that substance in Death Becomes Her? It is a bright pink substance. So, I mean, there's not a direct connection between those two, but if anyone on that writing team was even somewhat familiar with adrenochrome, it would have made sense to make that pink. But it's hard to separate real adrenochrome research from like blood magic and vampire novels.
Yeah, it really is. And one of the things that stood out to me most recently was it like 2 or 3 years ago, Bill Maher got really upset with the whole Jim Caviezel thing when he was talking about the child trafficking and stuff like that. And I think he actually mentioned adrenochrome. But the thing with Bill Maher that pisses me off is that he tells on himself all the time. Like he tries to tell these jokes and stuff, but we all know that he's telling the truth about a lot of stuff and that he's basically a hitman for the media. He tries to cover up stuff, you know?
So I've got all the context on this because this was one of the more fascinating intersections of adrenochrome being mentioned in like popular media outside of movies. This is when it starts being discussed in sort of like a news cycle. So Jim Caviezel, he's at Clay Clark Health and Freedom Conference that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was on a Friday, April 6th, 2022. So if anyone wants to go and find this, if you search for those terms all together, you'll find this exact video. And he's basically live streaming to an audience of about 5,000 people live. And then there's also like 500,000 more people watching it online. Here's exactly what he says is, quote, "They're pulling kids out of the darkest recesses of hell," says some other things. And then he makes the phrase, "the adrenochroming of children." I do like how he turned a noun into a verb. I don't think the word adrenochroming had ever existed before he said that out loud. I'm still not sure it's exactly a word, but now we've got this premise of harvesting adrenochrome from children. And then he goes on to loosely explain it. And he says, essentially, you have adrenaline in your body. When you're scared, you produce adrenaline. And if a child knows he's going to die, his body will secrete adrenaline. Technically, those are all true statements, but there's never really a connection between, and here's where the adrenochrome comes into play, and here's why torture is necessary. So you also produce adrenaline from things other than being tortured or scared. But this was the claim that he made. So he says that, and then on April 23rd, Bill Maher, he comes out, this is episode 13, season 19, and he says, "New rule, now that conservative Jim Caviezel and Lin Wood are sounding the alarm about adrenochrome, which is the belief that liberals literally drink the blood of terrified children for psychoactive effect. I've got one thing to say, don't knock it till you've tried it. It's really good." He kind of like jokes about it and talks about how it kicks in and like the hangover of it. But they're making jokes about it. And the way that he says, oh, it's this psychoactive drug that comes from terrified children. If you remove all the emotional language, yeah, it is a psychoactive drug that is in blood. And it's a technicality. I guess it's an unnecessarily extra qualification of terrified children that are tortured. That part, if you just remove that and just say adrenalized blood has a psychoactive substance in it, yes, that is non-conspiratorial. It might be taboo, but it is not even something that can really be debated. But usually when these debunkings or people making it silly, they have to include the fact that there's babies or there's children being terrorized as part of it.
Yeah, not to mention that wasn't Bill Maher's production company called Kid Love Productions or something like that? He probably
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sick shit. That's what this is.
And I mean, as a thought experiment, this is not me making any claims. I'm not even making subjective claims, but just in a Socratic like thought experiment way. If you are already at the height of Hollywood, you've got more money and resources and time that you know what to do with. You've got connections to Hollywood, science, politics, just everything. Like your Rolodex is jammed full, and you're bored one day. Like I assume Bill Maher probably is often, as I guess he's partnerless and childless. So he's just wondering, what do I do today? Hey, I heard about this thing called adrenochrome. I wonder if anyone I know can procure this. What are the chances that you think that A, they could procure it? Seems fairly likely that they could find it. But then even add that qualifier of like, oh, but it has to come from a screaming baby. Like even as like inefficient and impractical as that might seem, if there's somebody out there that's like, and you'll pay me how much for this? It does seem well within reason that someone could have procured this and tried it under the most crazy conspiracy theory terms. I would not put it past anyone to have actually at least tried this at some point just to see if there was anything to it.
Yeah, that's definitely what I think is going on for sure. The more you think about something like this, the more incriminating it gets, and the more you start to realize that, yeah, this is actually happening. And there's a lot of people out there that you don't even know if they're jacked up on it or not when you see them, like artists and stuff. I've always kind of tried to not really point any fingers at anything that wasn't obvious when it comes to this. But if you even throw it back to like when they mention it on Dr. Phil, when that crazy lady is on Dr. Phil talking about they tortured her child or something. I mean, it's not that real people don't experience it, you know, that's the issue with it. But on platforms like Dr. Phil, they kind of gaslight you a lot too. Like, I've noticed that. So I don't know if this is ever going to really, somebody's ever really going to come out in the public and say, hey, adrenochrome is real. I had some last night, and I'm
That episode that you're talking about, the Dr. Phil episode, that was from 2016. And at the very end of this episode, where the lady specifically, I mean, this is a quote from the show. The lady's name was Sherry, and she says, quote, she's talking about her daughter that either ran away or was kidnapped. She claims that people contacted her on social media taunting her, saying like, haha, we killed your daughter, we kidnapped her, we did all these things to her. This is all the things that she claims, but here's the quote that she says on air on this Dr. Phil episode. She says, I believe Jesse was tortured for the drug adrenochrome. Adrenochrome is a chemical that our body produces when we're extremely fearful or have a lot of distress. It gives you strength, it gives you vitality, and when you drink it, it gives you euphoria and power. The people that killed Jesse are harvesting it. So these are the claims. And if we break these things down, which is fairly important, so she says that it's a chemical our body produces when we're fearful or have distress. Technically true, although the body does not produce adrenochrome in response. It's producing adrenaline. Your body uses that adrenaline and says, whoa, we don't need this much. Let's not explode the heart. Let's go ahead and process some of this adrenaline in a way that the body doesn't have to react to it. So then it starts creating adrenochrome out of that. She also says it gives you strength and vitality. These are things that I don't believe are backed up anywhere. Even if you were to stretch Dr. Abram Hoffer's schizophrenia and adrenochrome hypothesis, it doesn't happen like within a minute of you ingesting it. It doesn't even happen within your lifetime of ingesting it. It would only happen through your progeny and through your other like bloodline. Then they potentially would reap some of these benefits, but only if you actually have like a nonstop extra adrenochrome in your system, not just a wild night out and you killed one baby. You don't get to live longer because of that one experience. Like it would have to be an ongoing thing, which maybe they do. And then the other thing she says is when you drink it, it gives you euphoria and power. Well, I do want to push back on a very important verb here of drink. From all the research I've found, it seems that adrenochrome is so unstable that sending it through your digestive system would pretty much have no effect. It would completely nullify it before it even got into your bloodstream at that point. The way that Abram Hoffer documented testing it was sublingually. They would get an aqueous solution of adrenochrome and they would spray it into their mouth and let it absorb under their tongue. There was also some intravenous where they injected it. But I don't think that anything beyond injection or taking it sublingually has had any real strong documented effect. In fact, the exact opposite. A lot of the cases where people have tried to smoke, snort, eat, even take a crystalline version of it, all of those seem to have zero effects. It almost renders it inert because of how unstable adrenochrome is. So it has to be fresh and it has to be aqueous. So maybe you can conflate that to like, you got to drink it straight out of a dead baby. I mean, technically, yeah, that's fresh and that's aqueous, but it's also not isolated. Like you're talking tiny, tiny bits, per parts per million. If you're just going to drink it straight out of someone's bloodstream. And again, you don't drink it, you would sublingually put it in your mouth. So all of that aside, this is kind of where the lady on Dr. Phil says, and then Dr. Phil makes sure at the end of the episodes, as the credits are scrolling, the last thing he says before the episode ends, he says they consulted the police captain of Wenatchee, Washington, which is where this lady was at. And he says, the police captain told us we have never had a case involving the drug adrenochrome. We've never even heard of it until Dr. Phil producers brought it to our attention. And I guess the weasel implication here is that, oh, well, if the police captain in a small town in Washington's never heard of this drug that's only been studied from the 30s to the 50s until it came under the domain of MK Ultra, I guess that means that it's not real and this is all made up. Now, in the same sentence, I will say that some of the things that Sherry is saying do seem completely made up. There's really no basis for any of the claims of strength, vitality, power, drinking. But euphoria, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of what the original discovery of adrenochrome came from. It came from this weird hallucinogenic euphoric property that no one could explain that was coming out of these EpiPens. Why is epinephrine causing people reliably and consistently to hallucinate? That's where it all kind of came from. But I don't think there was ever a study, and maybe it was suppressed by MK Ultra, but no one was like, hey, I took this expired EpiPen and I lost 20 years. I can run faster. I can breathe underwater. I can punch through walls. Like, none of that ever happened. A lot of the conspiracy tends to lean towards like supernatural properties, which is typically where it loses me a little bit. Like, I'm not going to discount supernatural as a concept in general, but when it comes to trying to prove someone with objective, repeatable, consistent facts, supernatural tends to not fit into that sort of diagram.
Fair enough. I think we've pretty much covered everything that we can on this topic. I just got one more question for you. What the hell does Freemasonry have to do with any of this stuff? And why is it that everywhere you look, you see Freemasonry seems to have its hands in these kinds of things? Because I know people that they're Masons and they have no clue what's going on. And then I know other, like maybe a handful of others that'll tell you, yeah, I've seen some dark stuff. So it just appears to me, and I remember saying this to you on your podcast, that Freemasonry is like being in a hallway with so many doors, and like depending on what your values and your character is capable of doing, they push you through one of those doors, and nobody else seems to know what's going on. So that lends to the mystery of it and the confusion,
Well, my favorite analogy tends to be, and it's evolving over time, but currently my favorite analogy is Cub Scouts. Why does someone join the Cub Scouts? Well, some of them want to learn how to tie knots and to be survivalists. Some of them want to make friends. Some of them just need a babysitter because their parents aren't alone. So you've got like the incentive for networking, the incentive for building relationships with other people, the incentive for learning new abilities and skills that you wouldn't otherwise. And there's also some like fraternal secret society-esque aspects of Cub Scouts too. Like, they've got initiation rituals and they wear badges and they perform rituals, even if it's not in like cloaks and dark rooms. Like, these are all parts of, and I guess Boy Scouts too have very strong ties to Freemasonry, which I guess kind of checks out and makes sense. But there's all sorts of different reasons why you might join Cub Scout. You could join Cub Scouts and not care about tying a knot ever. You might do it once to get the patch and never again because it doesn't interest you. You might not ever, create a fire with your hands in the middle of a forest just because they taught you how to do that in Cub Scouts. But there's also people that go explicitly to learn those things. And I kind of relate that same thing to Freemasonry, where there's a version of a Freemason that I call the Meatloaf Mason. And like, they just want to show up and hang out with their buds and eat some meatloaf and mashed potatoes after it's all over because it's a social setting. There's some people, I guess maybe like myself, that the attraction to Freemasonry is that you get access to libraries and books that are otherwise not available to the public unless you've got a lot of money and a lot of time to hunt them down. So it's like having a extra special library card. You got people that want to join because they hear that the police commissioner or the county comptroller is a member of this lodge. And if I could just schmooze up to them, then maybe I can somehow turn that into an advantage for me. All the different intentions. And I also strongly believe that it's impossible to prove intent. Even if someone admits or says they're doing something for a reason, you don't know that that's the real reason they're doing it. You can't really ever prove somebody's intent on anything, which is kind of the basis of our legal system. That's like the whole, like, is it premeditated or did you do it on accident? And like, I don't know, the guy's still dead. Like, he still shot him. Like, does it matter if I planned it a week ahead or if I did it in the spur? It does matter, right? Because intent has all this extra sort of like importance placed upon it. So let me answer your question of why does Freemasonry even come into this? In 1934, the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, specifically the northern jurisdiction, because America is split between northern and southern versions of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, long story, but that the guy that is sitting on the Supreme Council, they have all this money and they're figuring out, what do we do with this money? What kind of initiative do we take to sort of put our name on the map here and make us look altruistic? And they decide that concept of dementia praecox, if we can solve that, or if we can at least do more research into why 20-year-olds are skitzing out and now they, like, that family line dies because now they're going to have a partner, they can't take care of kids, how do we fix this, especially since it's affecting even rich people, right? It's like, sure, the Cheerio thing, maybe if you're poor, you can't afford all the nutrients, but like enough money can get you out of that predicament. Here's something that money can't buy you out of. You can't buy your way out of your kid developing early onset dementia. So they decide to put together a fund to investigate specifically dementia precox in order to unlock like the mysteries of the human brain, which makes sense, kind of on brand for Freemasons to be like, I want to know how the mind works. Like that's kind of their realm, right? So 1934, they decide that they're going to research dementia precox, and they do 4 different steps. First, they decide to set up this dementia precox committee under the auspice of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene. Second, they decide that this committee is going to be comprised of outstanding men, psychiatrists, and allies and representatives from the Supreme Council. So it's like they're going to, staff it with their own ranks. Then they decide that they're going to find a psychiatrist that'll be basically the field director for the entire country that will sort of guide all of this research. And then finally, they will annually get together and vote on grants to see, okay, where does the money this year go in terms of this dementia precox research? Through this funding, they end up giving money to Dr. Abram Hoffer and Smithies, who then start looking into this adrenochrome subject. So that's the direct connection, that there would be no adrenochrome research, at least not publicly, and it wouldn't have been funded if it weren't for the Scottish Rite 33rd degree Supreme Council Northern Jurisdiction. It wouldn't exist at all. So this is a very direct, provable, easy to show. In fact, if you look at any adrenochrome papers from the 1930s to the 1950s, on the very bottom of the front page of every one of these reports, it says special thanks to the Scottish Rite Supreme Council 33 NJ, because that's where the money was coming from. So there's the direct connection. It's really not even a subject of conspiracy or sort of like subjective assumptions. Like this is all well documented, proven. No one debates this or even sort of claims that it's not the case, unless you're just a random social media YouTuber or Facebooker that like goes through like, what's this adrenochrome and Freemasonry? I call BS, and then they move on with their day without actually looking into the factual basis on all this.
Yeah, fair enough. So tell everybody where they can find you.
ParanoidAmerican.com. You might not know it from our talk, but I just published comic books. I worked at Disney for 10 years, and I decided, hey, if I can do all this for Mickey and Goofy, why can't I make an MK Ultra comic book or cartoon using all the same things that I know here? So I did that. I started it in 2012. So you can find me there at ParanoidAmerican.com. Also on pretty much any social media network at Paranoid American, and on X, which is the only other place other than Rumble that I can post any of this adrenochrome stuff without getting taken down. And on there, it's just Paranoid America, no N at the end because it didn't fit.
Well, thanks for being on the Boundless Authenticity podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right.